Yeah, this is the MMT Tech Meetup, November 2021. And today we're going to be talking about Jamstack. So we've got fabulous speakers here, and I'm excited to kind of get going, really. So let's get cracking. So who am I? I'm Ilesh Mistry. I'm a CMS specialist for MMT Digital and a content MVP. If you want to contact me, use the QR code on the right. A little bit about MMT Digital. They help transform their clients' digital products, so they transform their business products into, making sure that their business performance is actually essential. And it's part agency, part consultancy. So we're leaders in combining technologies and design and lean product delivery. So if you need to contact them, the QR code's on the right. Just a shameless plug, really, but we are recruiting, probably like everyone else. But if you are looking to kind of switch careers and looking for a new opportunity, contact us via the QR code and just give me a shout, and then hopefully I can point you in the right direction. And also, just a little bit about Kontent by Kentico. I'm an MVP for them, and basically it's a cloud-native headless CMS that allows you to build websites and applications fast using any technology you want, really, because that's the beauty about headless CMSs. If you need to sort of like sign up to a free trial, you can use that QR code at the top. But also, more importantly, I think it's also a case that if you want to join their community, they've got a Discord section there that you can kind of join with them. And really about the MMT Tech Meetups, they're generally front-end driven topics. If you want to know more about these in the future, just follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter. And I'll be posting them regular updates. And this obviously is the final one for the year, but when we start back in the new year, we'll start picking these up again. If you want to talk at a future meetup or know somebody else who would be great, I've had recommendations even actually on this particular meetup itself, which is great for us. But just let me know if you want to kind of speak at future events. Just a little bit before we get started, just drop your questions on the chat. And I'm just checking, is Moriel okay? Hopefully. And yeah, we'll be recording these sessions. So I guess I should have announced that at the start, but we are recording these sessions. So just bear this in mind. And if you want to kind of do any social sharing, try and use the MMT hashtag, and also, drop in any of the Twitter handles that the various speakers will be presenting today. So today's agenda, we basically got myself. I'm going to do a quick talk about Jamstack-ing content. Then we've got Ben after me, who's going to be shipped JavaScript where it counts with MMT and Slinkity. And then we've got Phil after that, rendering models at scale, wherever your framework or whatever your framework. And then we've got Moriel supporting localization in Jamstack applications. But that's not the end of it. We've also got part 2 of this agenda, which is Scott's going to be talking about SvelteKit and the content layer. And then we've got Alistair finishing things off with making assets fly on the Jamstack with Image CDNs. So we've got a great lineup. I'm just going to flick over to the other deck quickly. So hopefully everyone can see that screen. Hi everyone, welcome to the MMT Tech Meetup November 2021 and my talk on Jamstack-ing content. If you joined late, who am I? So I'm basically Ilesh Mistry. I'm a CMS specialist that works at MMT Digital and a content MVP. If you want to contact me, you can use the QR code on the right. What I'll be covering. So I'm going to be almost, briefly covering what Jamstack is. Probably even like, having a few sort of suggestions on. Sometimes people think static site generators are actually the same as, it's basically the same as Jamstack, and I'll be talking about that a little bit. How a headless CMS could be part of a Jamstack is something I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to talk about how you can integrate Kentico content with Next.js on there, and some takeaways from that. So just really a quick overview of this kind of stuff. What is Jamstack? So basically, it's a concept really describing the architectural design for websites and applications. So it's really just a way of, recognizing an approach applications and websites. It stands for JavaScript, API, and markup, all working together to create that Jamstack approach. What it does is that the combination of these type of elements together just makes the web faster, secure, and obviously easier to scale as well. There's an excellent developer experience with the tools available out there, and there's so many things that you can do with the Jamstack side of things. And it's hugely popular and recognized by developers. Some people may not know this, but the name Jamstack is identified by Matt and Chris from Netlify. So that was quite interesting if you're not aware of that already. So static site generators, there's always that misconception to say that that means that all we're dealing with is Jamstack sites. It's not always the case. That's, you can still have Jamstack without static site generators. But the key thing here is that static site generators or generators of those sort do help speed up the process and help build the foundations. And I feel like that's like a really important point when it comes to like creating Jamstack websites. And I feel that, they're definitely recommended if you are looking to start with Jamstack sites. So how can headless CMSs be, a part of Jamstack? Headless CMSs can be, I would probably class it as the API part, where the content can be retrieved from the CMS and obviously used on websites and applications. You can also reuse the content, which is, I think, one of the beauties of having something like a headless CMS is that you can use it in applications, you can use it in websites, you can use it on chatbots, other sort of channels, really. And the good thing about that is obviously entering the content once and then surfacing it in different areas. And also what you can obviously use is the API to serve to those different channels, which is the handy bit from the headless CMSs that are available out there. You can also make a static website, an application feel dynamic. So there's no, elements where you may think, oh, you might have to rebuild everything. You can probably use Next's ISR, and that's quite handy, especially if you want to kind of render something out quite quickly as well. So just a quick thing about content. We've already mentioned that the headless CMS out there, but there's 3 ways that you could utilize this API approach. So especially within the Jamstack model, you can either use a delivery REST API from content. You can use any of their SDKs, but also something new that they've actually released is the GraphQL API, which is quite handy to have a different approach, a more refined approach when it comes to the API data retrieval. So just going to quickly talk about Next.js and content. What I'm really trying to show here is the fact that the starter site is utilized, and you can get up and going in literally like a couple of minutes. And that's the beauty of like working with headless CMSs and Jamstack sites that work together. Like it's really important to kind of think that it's not like a big hurdle to jump through. You can get going quite quickly. And some of the steps I identified here, where you just create a next app and then add in the sample content from content, change the API keys and get the site running quick and simple. And you can make changes onto a website straight away. So I'm going to quickly show you that. So the starter site stuff has already been set up, but I just want to quickly show a little bit of content and see how that kind of looks on the front end. So let me just click over to here. So this is a starter site that's already been running, part of the installation when I actually added it in. I just wanted to show that the fact that how quickly can we kind of change this panel, and do we need to do any rebuilding? Do we need to do anything else? And the answer is really no. Like, you don't need to do any rebuilding, as long as your site is running. There's no deployments involved or anything like that. So if I just flick over to content, so this is content by Kentico. It's just an interface in here, and the key thing I need to change here is, say, something like the main hero section. And I'm just going to create a new version of this. And I'm just going to bring across some of the stuff. So I'm going to cheat a little bit, especially with select an asset, and I'll just remove this one and add in some text. So put that in there. Cool. So let me just quickly publish that. And then flick back to the other one and reload the page. This is where things may take a little bit of, or may not work as we expected. So just going to give it another reload. There we go. So that content has already been changed from the headless CMS straight away, and it's coming through without actually doing any rebuilding of content. I'm just going to flick back to the deck. So really what I'm trying to illustrate here is the fact that, there's some takeaways that could come from this, in the sense of, Jamstack sites are not always produced from static site generators, but it does help. Headless CMS is a great options to include dynamic elements in there. Jamstack is great if you're looking for fast, high performance and secure and scalable, websites and applications, because they seem to kind of help serve that purpose. You can see that it's quite easy to set things up. I was up and running in literally like 5 minutes. And if somebody's out there who's not familiar with this kind of stuff, it's a great handy way to get up and start going, and then they can go ahead and tweak things as they wish and customize it as they wish. If you're looking to get into Jamstack with CMSs, then obviously Kontent is a strong candidate for you, especially I believe because they've now introduced the delivery graph API, which is a different angle of retrieving content. And I think the beauty of what we've got here, integrating with headless CMS, is the fact that you don't have to rebuild, you don't have to kind of do a deployment all the way through the environments out there, just to kind of see dynamic changes on your website, and you can obviously get up and running very fast. Okay, so that's it from me. Thank you. Like I mentioned, it's a very short presentation. If you need to contact me, use the QR code on the right, and we can go on to the next sessions. So who we got next is Ben. So Ben, just let us know when you're ready. And then we've got Phil, and then Moriel after that, and then we've got Scott, and then Alistair. I will stop presenting.
Okay, I think I'm ready.
Hey.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is the mic?
It's not bad, I think, 10.
All right, nice. I was surprised. Well, if you can't tell, I'm out of town right now. So I brought everything with me that I could to record a little talk here before we break to make some Thanksgiving lunch when families come in from the airport. But For now, you can enjoy this little bit of Christmas decor over here. And just for the fans, I made sure to always bring a whiteboard with me whenever I do a meetup talk. You might know me as the person who brings a whiteboard to everything. So I have a little travel edition right here, just to make sure that we have some visuals today. I don't do slides. But to introduce myself, I'm Ben Holmes. You can find me at bholmesdev on Twitter. I think that flashed for a second. But I'm a full stack web developer that's also working on a little open source project called Slinkity right now, which is an add-on to your existing 11D sites. And this talk, I wanted to talk about shipping JavaScript where it counts. You may have heard the mantra that's been echoed by Astro so far about ship less JavaScript. I'm very inspired by that myself. I think the real thing is like, it's all about the opt-in mindset and shipping JavaScript where users actually need it. So that's what we're going to talk about. And to start us off here, I have a little visual that I introduced over at Jamstack-conf actually, of the two sides of Jamstack development that exist today. As Ilesh mentioned, Jamstack is not just static site generation, though it does help. It's really a spectrum of needs and technologies that people are using to take in CMS data, bolt it onto some sort of front end that people are able to browse, and then loading it with continuous deployment and everything else to make sure that you can quickly deploy changes. And the two sides to this, the first one being sort of the, as I've called it, the 11D or Jekyll summer salad. And this is the side where you're sticking with the lightest tools that you possibly can. You're using those leafy greens like Markdown and plain HTML, liquid, or Nunjux templates to keep your SEO nice and strong. And then if you want to use CMS data, they give you a nice outlet to load in CMS information with pre-rendering or with server-side rendering if you're using serverless functions. Where you can just point to the CMS that you want, create a nice little data store, which 11D's data cascade can help you with, which we'll demo in a second. And then you roll those into some static HTML and CSS. So there are a few like key benefits I would say to this, but I'll open it to y'all that are in the meetup right now. Can anyone name like reasons you would go with 11D or Jekyll for your Jamstack? Like what are the key benefits y'all think? I guess I can look at the chat as well. You can also unmute yourself, potentially. Variety of templates supported. I agree. Because you're doing everything server side, it's very flexible to just use whatever templating language you want and then shipping straight HTML on the other side. As long as you teach it how to squeeze the HTML out, that's pretty much all you need. I was going to like write it interactive style, but it's very hard to write this thing vertically. It's so tiny. Variety of templates. What else is there? Opting into JavaScript, developer control of everything that is shipped. Yeah, dev control, I agree. And that's definitely bleeding more into like the Astro side of like having switches in order to opt into shipping JavaScript resources as well as other resources. Scoping data from remote or scooping data, agreed. I like that term, scooping data from remote APIs. And that's a lot of benefits already. One that I would definitely say is like SEO is the big one that everyone likes to talk about. It's one that Zach Leatherman has mentioned as well when demoing 11D because you're not having to wait for JavaScript to load into a div with a loading spinner. Google's easily able to crawl your markup and find all of the information. There are no resources or time to interactive delays that could sort of result in a worse user experience. So, I mean, writing those up here, that's why I sort of said that this side of the spectrum favors user experience. And that's because you're only shipping the bare minimum tools that the user needs to ensure that load times are the things you're prioritizing, not necessarily developer capability, which is also the Achilles heel of using something like Jekyll or 11D, where if you're sticking with those basic tools, there's a lot of friction to add more interactive elements at the moment. So if you want to reach for JavaScript interactivity, multi-step checkout forms, user objects, global states, all the things that you imagine are more app-like, those are the pain points that people are reaching trying to use Jekyll or server-driven apps back in the day, which is why we have the other side of the spectrum that was sort of created when the single-page app craze started coming onto the scene. This was also around like ES 2015, when JavaScript started becoming a very viable option to make things both server side and client side. And I've referred to that as sort of the React beef burger, because the salad keeps things light and the burger brings you all of the protein and all of the umami flavor that you need in order to bring all of the interactivity a user could ever want. That I would sort of call it the infinite toolbox, where you have all of the features that a user would want at the expense of maybe a heavier learning curve, because now you have to teach all of your developers React, for example, or maybe all they had was the HTML and CSS background they learned in high school. That got them through developing simple static sites. But now you're introducing a lot more technologies on top to have those capabilities. So you add sort of more friction. And are there any benefits people can name for like a reactive site, like Next.js and Gatsby, Nuxt, SvelteKit, all of the ones that are component based? What are the reasons y'all reach for those? Component ecosystem, that is true. That's definitely one that I reach for React in particular, because it seems like everyone latched onto React and you ended up with like every design library using React for sure. Even for static content like text, you want to use Material UI's React components because it's just a nicer experience. You can slot it into anything. So it's like components, component libraries really, because now libraries are easier to load in if they're JavaScript based. You have easy to get started because so many people use it that you just have an enormous Stack Overflow community at this point. So especially if you're using one of the more major frameworks like React, not saying that one is better or worse, just saying that these tools are very popular. So it's sort of lowered that barrier to entry. Even if the learning curve is more intense than plain HTML, Tailwind is also an example. Complex app UI use cases for sure. State management, that's the main one that I imagine is React introduced the idea that UI is a function of state. It's not just the UI that you ship when you're pre-rendering something. So when you introduce that function, you're able to change the output depending on what the user actually wants. So when you want to introduce that, you need JavaScript, is the simple side of it, as much as we hate to say it. And then easier to learn for a product team. Yeah, easier hiring really is something there too. It's like easy team formation around a tool without worrying that you made the wrong choice. So I'd say those are like some pretty big benefits as well. We have an equal sized list here of what I would say are two completely different sets of benefits. Where on this side, you're all about getting that data easily, using any templating language that you want because the tools can be flexible, improving SEO. And over here, you have your component libraries, the large developer ecosystem, and state management, as well as like easier hiring practices. Because if you have a CS degree, you're probably going to know JavaScript more than you know CSS, I hate to say. I've had to learn that the hard way, trying to teach other people in college boot camps. But those are like the two major concerns. And I would say that when you're choosing a project on the outset, you want to choose a tool that's going to give you the best of all of these. But if you're choosing between like Next.js and Jekyll, they're so polarizingly different that it's hard to tell which one is going to be the best and also which one's going to be future-proof. An example that I would give is like developing the New York Times or a basic newsletter maybe, or no, a newspaper website, like a local newspaper. I keep stepping backwards, but say you're starting to build a local newspaper and all you want to do on the outset is host a series of articles that are written by your editors. You're just digitizing those newspapers directly and you want those available on a number of routes. For something like that, starting with Jekyll is totally fine. You just upload all your markdown files. It squeezes them out into HTML. You add some basic styles. Maybe you can find a style sheet from any online resource at this point in order to theme it. And then you have your newsletter up and running. And then the developers are happy with this choice. Maybe they chose 11D and they sort of keep their heads down like, please don't ask for image carousels. Please don't ask for image carousels. And then they come in and say, it would be nice if we had an image carousel on the homepage. You realize, oh, shoot. well, 11 isn't really helping with React. We may have made the wrong choice. Maybe web components can do something, but that's kind of hard. So you are in this point where you chose a great tool for what you needed, and the load times were great. But as you needed to add more tools to the toolbox, you realized the toolbox wasn't big enough pretty much. So this is something that Rich Harris popularized with his talk on transitional apps, where he said, documents and apps aren't really a dichotomy. Your needs exist on a spectrum between the two. And you realize that as your product grows, because no one can predict what a product will be 10 years from now. So you really want to draw like a spectrum between them and figure out where on the spectrum your needs actually lie. And in our newspaper example, your needs start squarely over here and you're totally safe with the salad. And then as you add more technologies like user logins to personalize or gate experiences, maybe those image carousels, multi-step user login forms, anything that JavaScript-driven library could help with, you realize your needs are getting closer and closer to the burger. And you want to figure out which mindset you want to use here. And the thing that's sort of encouraged these days is to just choose the infinite toolbox way over here and overshoot the user's needs and progressively opt out in order to get to a better performance metric. So you start with something like Next.js maybe, and then you start introducing code splitting, opting out of hydration, maybe React server components. Not super experienced with those, but I know they're amazing. And you add all of those onto your stack in order to progressively improve performance. And this is great, but if you sort of look at statistics, 95% of people on average stick with the defaults of whatever tool they're given. So most developers are going to start with Next.js. They're not going to worry about any of the performance concerns, and they'll just deal with the lighthouse scores later, as long as the product people don't get mad. And I hate to be cynical about it, but when you use opt-out, it's something that the developer has to actively do, but the users are going to suffer until they act on it. So the other mindset that's sort of emerging right now with this idea of islands architecture is starting at the other end of the spectrum and progressively opting in to meet the users where they are without overshooting and shipping too many tools. So this is the mindset that Astro introduced with the sort of opt-in preaching, where you start with a static template and then you're able to progressively add JavaScript components like React, Vue, or Svelte, and just insert them directly into that static HTML. If you've ever used MDX, it's a very similar concept, but with a number of knobs to sort of fine tune how much JavaScript you actually need to ship. Like maybe you want to use Material UI's text component, and you say, I don't need to ship JavaScript for this text component. So I'm going to not ship JavaScript at all. I'm going to avoid opting into that. And then when you want to add that image carousel, you say, this experience does need JavaScript. So I'll say this component, don't ship anything. And then this component, do ship JavaScript. And maybe I can ship it lazily, only ship it when we scroll to that element on the page. Or maybe I ship it when we're on mobile, but not on desktop. Any number of sort of dimensions that you want to make sure things are optimized. So in that sort of landscape, you start by introducing those components, and then you decide if you want to load JavaScript and when, so that you're meeting the users where they are, and you're only shipping the amount of JavaScript that people actually need. So that's sort of my spiel on how the spectrum works as I see it, and why I think the opt-in mindset would probably be a better choice to make sure that the defaults of your tool are going to favor the user instead of just favoring the developer. So to sort of demo this, I have a little demo website using Slinkity here. So can you all see the screen? I'm hoping so. Yes, all right. Okay, well, y'all can see yourselves right now. But there are a few tools that we're going to glue together here. The first one is going to be Eleventy, which was like that summer salad, basic static templates. And then we're going to bolt on this fancy bundler called Vite. And this is sort of the bundler to end all bundlers in a way, where it starts with an HTML file as the entry point, and then it'll pick up on any component framework you could possibly teach it. Like you want to compile React, it'll have a React plugin. You want Vue, it has a Vue plugin. And it has hot module reloading, all these other buzzwords to make sure it's a super fast developer experience as well. So it's a tool that is being used by SvelteKit and Astro, and now being used by Slinkity, which is sort of a, it's been called a meta framework, but it's mostly a plugin into your existing Eleventy sites to add Vite on top of your workflow and introduce components into the Eleventy sites you already have. So there aren't any refactors required if you're coming from the Eleventy landscape, because we believe like if you started with that summer salad, we should have zero developer friction to opt in and meet users where they are. So that's what this tool is trying to do. And I have a demo site here that's going to show off what it's capable of. So here I have just the regular 11D command. We're going to build a static t-shirt merchandise shop. So if I run start, it's going to run 11D here. And in my browser, I should be able to see this simple storefront that has broken images. Hold on. Shoot. This got messed up before the demo. This is supposed to reference just the asset folder. There we are. All right, this is a merch shop for 11D. If you're unaware, 11D's mascot is a possum. So this is the set of all of the possums you could possibly want, 11 to be precise. And if you want to buy one of them now, you can name your price. We started with a sensible default, in my opinion, around $100,000. And then you can decide how you want the possum to ship that. Or you can use USPS ground, which is by far the slowest option, but we've kept it here for legacy reasons. You can give them turn-by-turn directions and then submit your order. So very simple e-commerce experience, but as you can see, it's quite plain at the moment. So we started with this basically empty toolbox of just HTML. And now we want to add on our first tool, which is going to be SCSS maybe, because it's our favorite CSS preprocessor. We want to easily add styles to our website. So what we're going to do is we're going to just introduce Slinkity onto this flow. And all we have to do for that is make sure that Slinkity is installed into our project and reach for the Slinkity CLI instead of 11D. It uses all the same flags that 11D would. So you can just keep using whatever command you had. And then over here, we'll see the same server, this time with Vite running in the background. And this lets us do all sorts of things like compiling SCSS without any extra configuration. So I have a style sheet here that's going to reach into the root of my project. This is using an import alias, by the way, which is something Vite will help you with out of the box. And yes, you can use import aliases for style sheet links, which is so crazy, in my opinion. And it's going to reach into this styles folder here. It's going to grab the SCSS file directly. I don't even have to say CSS. I can just say, that's the file extension. Look at this HTML file and just figure out the rest for me. Then if I head back over here, we should see our styles in a moment. Let me double check. Yes. Okay, so this is a base style sheet that I have here that just specifies a font and some basic padding that we can work with on top of our site. And it's going to give us hot module reloading. So if I want to play around with styles and sort of sculpt them as I'm working on this site, it looks like something's going on with these query parameters. Let me see here. Yeah, there we go. So as you can see, the live reloading is very, very quick. It's not even refreshing the page or reprocessing HTML. It's just shipping off the new style sheet directly into your browser because it's able to figure out which parts of the page changed and which parts didn't. So you get a super fast developer experience without even using JavaScript on the outset. So we can remove that, and maybe we want to have a multi-column layout for this site. And for that, I could reach for small CSS, Steph Eckel's amazing styling resource here, and I can just plop that into my site here. And then if I head over to my index page in order to style it, I can just apply small CSS grid like so. And we should see a grid appear. And we have some styles that we can tweak here. We can get super fast developer feedback as we're finding the perfect size for this, add some extra gap, and now everything is looking how we want it to. And then maybe we want to add a pattern background as well. That's something that relative paths can totally work with here. This is a pattern resource that I use all the time. It's from Thomas Semler. You should definitely go follow him for resources like these. But this is just a basic pattern that I have pulled up here. It's an SVG. And what's nice is we don't have to deal with any pass-through copying or file system management. Vite's able to just crawl around and find anything that we want. So if I head over here and I just drag this guy directly into my styles folder, like so, I should be able to just find that resource as a URL here. So if I say background, URL, and then just the relative path. And I guess we need to escape some characters. But now we see our pattern magically appear, and we can tweak it to our heart's content if we want, make it 2 rems, to make it a little more dramatic. We can see that too. And then over here, if we want to tweak this guy as well, I have another style set up here, a 2-column layout. I can head over to my t-shirt file, which is generated for all the routes on our site, thanks to pagination. And then I can just apply that, and I should see those styles appear as well. And that's pretty much it. In a matter of minutes, I was able to add SCSS and sort of debug what the styles I wanted. And if you're put off by this sort of off the beaten path styling, it's not really about the destination, in my opinion. It's about the journey. And as you can see, it was very easy for us to just experiment with new ideas and quickly see live reloading in our browser. So I think this is like an amazing prototype tool to just use plain HTML. So we have all of this set up, but maybe we want to add some interactivity to this experience. I have a little idea here of maybe we want to suggest like a carousel of other t-shirts to sort of upsell our customers and say, if you like this one, you might like this one too. And it's a pretty common flow in e-commerce, in my opinion. So we were good using just plain HTML for the submission form even, but for something like that, we need something that's JavaScripty. And if we want to introduce that, we can install React into our project directly in order for Vite to pick it up as a dependency. And I think I installed that wrong. There we go. And in a couple seconds when that's done, we should have React and React DOM as a resource now, which Slinkity is able to pick up on. And to insert a component, we're going to use something called a shortcode. So this is something that's generic to in Markdown files, Nunjucks, Liquid, and eventually using full-on JSX and Svelte as a templating language as well. Nunjucks is not going to be like the only templating language you can use. Pretty much everything is fair game because of that flexible templating that we talked about earlier. So to insert it, I can just call on our React shortcode and then pass it the name of a React component that we have. And I have a pre-built one here called Possum Upsell. This is going to use Reach UI's amazing accessible carousel. And we can plop that onto the page just by name. And then it receives one prop, as we can see, the t-shirts that we want to add. And for that, we can just reach for an existing prop that is passed to this component. So in 11D, we have global data that is accessible to all of our templates. And one of those is this t-shirts.yaml, which is the list of t-shirts that we saw earlier. And we can just pass that directly to our component for it to render those t-shirts into an actual carousel. So if I start this up again, we should see it discovers React and React DOM as dependencies. And sure enough, we had our server rendered React component come in, and now our fully interactive component. And as you can imagine, this is flexible to not just using React, maybe Svelte or Preact, so that it's a smaller bundle size when you do reach for that interactivity. But for this, it was a very simple thing to set up. And if we want to make sure that we don't render any JavaScript to the page, this is kind of an opt-out flow, but it will change to an opt-in in the future. You can say what rendering mode you actually want to use. And it looks like I'm messing up something here. Ooh, a little typo there. If I add this back, then we should see now we have the statically rendered component here. It's not interactive anymore, but we're no longer shipping any JavaScript. We're using a component framework as just another templating language. So you have infinite flexibility for that sort of thing. And if you want to move back to hydration, we got it here. And we see there's way too many possums, possum overflow. So what we got to do is truncate this to just the list of possums we actually want. And I have a little demo here of how we could just generate a random set of 3 so that we constantly upsell different products on our website. We're not showing the same ones over and over again. We can even use AI to optimize it or something like that. But now we see every user is going to get a unique experience because we're using JavaScript to generate a random range of possibilities. And each of these are clickable to just browse the website to your heart's content without ever going back to the homepage. So this was a little demo of everything that could be possible, starting from the summer salad and progressively adding tools. In the future, we want to work on state management across different islands, and we want to work on maybe single page app capabilities for page transitions, all sorts of things to move you closer and closer to that burger as those needs arise. So if you want to follow that journey, you can follow us at slinkity.dev on Twitter, try to post weekly updates with a larger whiteboard that y'all can see. And otherwise, you can follow me personally if you're interested in that. I think Slinkity is a more interesting account, but I tweet random stuff too. So hopefully this was very informative for y'all. I see I'm a bit over time here, but yeah, I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank y'all for joining me.
Ilesh, I think you're on mute, just in case you're addressing us all. There we are.
Sorry.
That was my audio.
all here. Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Ben, for presenting. I think, like, I don't know if there was any questions. I know that there's a lot of comments on the presentation that you did, but more observational kind of stuff. I think there's one on the basis that if you can post some of all of the sort of like sites and frameworks that you mentioned, maybe
Doing that
put
now.
them on the channel or something. Oh, wait, space. But yeah, I think really good. Are there any questions for Ben? No worries. If not, we can always pick them up afterwards. So thanks, Ben. Next up is Phil. Just let us know when you can start sharing.
All right, let's see if I can start sharing. I believe. Oh, I thought I was sharing, but am I? Is it true?
Yeah.
I am. Amazing.
Yes.
Okay. All right. If I turn my camera back on as well. Oh no, it's one or the other. Okay. No worries. Okay. How's the volume? Are people hearing me? Okay?
Perfect.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
All right. Right then. Well, in which case, I'll start my little timer and we'll get going. Thanks ever so much. I mean, I love speaking at the same event as Ben. That's great. It's so fascinating to see that. I think that's brilliant work and I love it. But let's get on to the next one. So this is rendering models at scale. Whatever your framework is the title I've loftily given this. But yeah, hello from me and thanks for having me here. It's great to be here. I'm always interested in finding the right approach for a project. And that talk from Ben is an interesting one because it does talk about the options that you've got and the ways that you can use a tool. But finding the right approach for a project is really important. And there's no one size fits all really on the web. I learned this the hard way working at an agency. I had a long career at an agency where you work with different clients and they all have different architectures. I think anyone who's been in an agency world maybe kind of recognizes some of the sentiment, but there are lots of architectures to work with and lots of possible approaches we might come with. But web development is not like Highlander. There isn't only one. There can be many ways that we might solve the problems. And so I think there's fun to be had in finding the right thing. There are many different architectures available. We're here talking about Jamstack related things in particular, but even within Jamstack, there are lots of different tools and technologies we might look at. And you just look at the agenda tonight, there are lots of different tools on show here. I'm very eager to find the simplest solution I can to things because of things like the ease of the implementation, the cost implications, how you're going to support the project, over its lifespan and all of the rest of it, how much confidence you've got in it, how robust it is. So all of those kind of things that did lead me a few years ago to an approach that I didn't have a name for, and I think I started calling it the short stack, but didn't trademark that. Damn it, that would have been great. Made people think of pancakes, but really that became known as the Jamstack, and that kind of grew a little bit in terms of its popularity, as Ilesh mentioned earlier on. In fact, he's already given a great introduction to it, but let me offer this one additional kind of definition that I sometimes find useful. Whereas Jamstack is a way of thinking about how to build for the web. The UI is compiled, the front end is decoupled, and data is pulled in as needed. And there's a few things to unpack there, but this decoupling part is a key item. Putting some distance between when you generate all of the views and when they're requested is key. And we're kind of moving here from generating responses to every single request that comes in on demand to a model where we're generating the responses to requests in advance. So, we're building those assets ready for when they're needed, like we did in the 90s. So, plenty of people are critical of Jamstack, saying, isn't this a new name for an old thing? Yeah, kind of. But the tooling's evolved, and we'll get to some of that in a second. You'll often hear this term pre-rendering, which is probably the first of our buzzword bingo for this evening. Pre-rendering is a very popular term you hear at the moment, and this is a key thing of building things in advance. And when I think about the power and some of the benefits of the Jamstack, a lot of this comes from when we do things at build time versus when we do things at request time. It kind of de-risks things a little bit. But what it also does is it does this decoupling. It means that front-end code is no longer limited to being a product of a back-end system. I think many front-end developers have been frustrated in the past of their wings being clipped because they couldn't get do the craft and the engineering that they wanted, because what they were creating ended up being output of a different system. So when we decouple like this, we get chances for greater efficiency. However, it's not just when we build things, it's also where we build things. And this is where the boundaries start to blur a little bit, and when we get closer to the topic that I put in my title. The fact that views are being rendered perhaps now in a serverless function versus in an application server, a big web server that might be doing things on demand, that doesn't sound like decoupling in the way I described a moment ago. And serverless functions is perhaps another one of our buzzword bingo entries. But I would still argue that if we're moving some of the rendering jobs from a big monolithic application server into a serverless function that has a very different kind of footprint, we're still in this realm of front-end code no longer being limited to a product of a back-end system. So it's that kind of efficiency and kind of freedom that I like. I love these sorts of discussions, and I realize I've jumped in without really giving much of an introduction to myself. So my name is Phil Hawksworth, as you heard at the beginning. I'm Director of Developer Experience at Netlify. I'm based in the UK, just outside London in St Albans. If you want to get information from me or ask questions at any stage, you can always get me on Twitter, Phil Hawksworth there. Also, I put a lot of these ramblings into a book, Modern Web Development on the Jamstack, which I co-authored with Matt Billman, who's the co-founder of Netlify and CEO of Netlify. You can get that and the audiobook version. Find that at Jamstack book. It's not me narrating it. Don't worry. Movie didn't make it out for Christmas. Hopefully next year. There's also kind of ramblings about this kind of topic from my lovely colleagues at in the DX team at Netlify in this podcast. You can find that at Interesting. That's remotely interesting, where we talk about all of these kind of architectures and silly things as well. But that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. So let's talk about what I had in the title of this thing. I really want to talk about some of the benefits of Jamstack and the limits that we reach. And then, since we're having this ceiling that's imposed on us from some of these limits, I want to talk about an example where I kind of tried to break through that ceiling and try to use some interesting techniques around that, and then move into something a little bit more formal in terms of removing that ceiling and adopting some more kind of emerging common practices, all to do with rendering and scale. So let's dive in with the benefits and limits. Well, we've heard some of the benefits already, but I'll rattle through quickly. I wanted to just highlight that with Jamstack, again, you've heard this from Ilesh really, that we have kind of greater security, scale, speed, and experience. Forgive me for that last one. I'm talking there about things like the developer experience and probably the workflow. Having a Jamstack architecture really does impact all of these things and more besides. These are the ones I commonly call out, and I'll perhaps skip over those for the moment because I kind of want to talk a little bit more about perhaps simplicity, and look at the compare and contrast. Rebecca, make the film. Okay, I'm on it. Compare and contrast like the traditional stack with the Jamstack, and I've shown this kind of example, this illustration in other talks, but really thinking about what happens when with the Jamstack, rather than the HTTP requests coming from a client and having to travel through all of this infrastructure of load balancers and web servers and databases and passing all the way back, everything's being delivered directly from a CDN. And we might be populating that CDN by some automated build processes that might be triggered by things like code and content changes, as we saw in the demo at the very, very beginning. this is how we can do things ahead of time and decouple things, which seems like it's a conflict with what I was talking about in the title, but we'll get to that, because this model really gives us a key benefit, which is immutable atomic deploys. So in other words, when we're thinking about a lifespan of a project and how things live in the live environment, when we want to do another deployment, we can start pushing those changes, but none of those changes, even though they might be arriving, these different assets arriving in our hosting infrastructure, they might be arriving at different times. So only when they're there in totality does the traffic start getting routed to that latest deploy. And since things are immutable, it means that the previous deploys live on. We're not changing the state of an application server, which means we can roll back at any time to anywhere in our history. Deploys are immutable, they don't change, and they're atomic, they're complete when they go live. And that comes from this kind of model of being able to do things in advance and get them to the CDN. However, and here comes the rub, the problem is, what about very large sites with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of URLs and views? How do we do that all on demand, all ahead of time, and be able to have that same kind of model? And also, what another challenge, how about things like user-generated content, pages that are populated by the input from a user that might then create a view? With these kind of things, we reach a bit of a ceiling. So let's talk about how we break through that ceiling with an example. Now, I've shown this example lots of times over the years, but bear with me. If you've seen this before and you're rolling your eyes, I'm going to explain how I've kind of evolved this with a fresh kind of implementation in the back. So this is a little site I made called vlolly.net. You can go there, you can put some information in there, and you can create a little lollipop page that you can share with your friends with a little message. I wrote up how I did this and what I'm going to give a very quick summary of in an article on CSS Tricks, and you can find that at Lollytricks. By the way, all of these slides and the URLs here, I'll share a URL to this at the very end. So in case you're scribbling things down, this will be shared at the end. But the approach for this is, it's a site that has, well, actually, it has thousands of unique pages, all of which are user-generated content. People have been creating these lollies, and those all need to be built as URLs. And the approach I took to this was, well, I decided that I'd have new content would be rendered on demand as a fallback. And you might recognize a word there straight away from things we've been talking about earlier on. We're talking about on demand. But critically, I think actually it's the as a fallback part which makes this interesting. So the way it works is, if you want to create a new page, a new lolly to share, ultimately it's a form that you post. That posts to a serverless function. It's a Jamstack site, but you can add serverless functions to embellish it and kind of expand on what you can do with Jamstack. And this serverless function has a couple of jobs. It saves that data to a database. In this instance, I'm using Fauna, but I could use any database as a service through its API. When you submit a new page, it also triggers a new build. So it generates the site again with all of the pages that it finds in the database. And then it redirects the user who submitted that to the URL that will exist for the new page. So it's a lolly page like this. So in this case, I've created one for Moriel. Now, at the point that you do this, the page doesn't exist yet because the site is still being generated to add that page in. So the fallback is to route the user to a serverless function that generates that view on demand. So in other words, we're rebuilding and filling the gaps whenever there's new content. And while we're waiting for that to happen, the 404 handler is a serverless function that renders that on demand. Now that works very nicely, but it's not quite where we'd like to get to make this much more robust. But I want to show you what the serverless function looks like that does this piece of work. Here it is, and you're squinting at it because it's tiny for you, but don't worry, because I'll unpack it a little bit. So the syntax here isn't really what matters. It's really just about the blocks and what the jobs of work are. So the first thing we do is we require a library to access that database as a function. I mentioned I'm using FaunaDB, so I'm using their library as a client. Then I also pull in a page template, which is it's the view that you see. It's a JavaScript template literal that I can poke some data into and get a page that I'll return to the user. Then I do some connecting to the database. with making a connection there. So I've got a way to get that data. And then then we're into the realms of serverless functions. So this is the handler function for the serverless function, where I start to do things like get the URL, get the ID of the lolly in question from the URL, and then use that ID in my query for the database. Again, the syntax for this isn't important. It's the mechanics that we're really interested in here. So I go off and make my request from the database, get the data pertaining to that lolly, the flavors, the message, and what have you. And when I've got that data, then I squirt that into the page template and return that to the user with a 200. That's all really that's going on here, other than a little bit of error handling. That's all that this serverless function does. Now, the nice thing about this is that it's not one framework or another. It's not built into one library or what have you. It's JavaScript, and you could add this to anything. Any framework that you're currently using, you could add this to. This is a bit of routing to a serverless function, and that's kind of it. That will kind of result with this page. However, every time I'm glad my lexicon is meeting with approval. Got to watch myself. Of course, every time that someone creates one of these pages, we're adding to the heft of the site. We're creating a site with more and more pages, which is why there are now many thousands of pages. So what we might do here is to add to the techniques we've already got, is when there are lots of pages, maybe we'll cache the builds. So in other words, in the build infrastructure, in this case in Netlify, what I also added is, well, every time I build the site, I cache all of the pages that I built, so that the next time I build the site, I'll only build the pages that have been required since the last render. Now that's fine and that works, but we'll talk about a limitation of that in a second. I'd also just like to throw out that if you were to go to that lolly page a second ago, if you were accessing it from the US, it should also then note that you're in the US and reroute you to a popsicle page instead of a lolly page, so that way it's kind of got some localization. I did that as a localization demo. I won't get into exactly how that works. That's probably a whole other talk, and we've got Moriel coming up anyway to talk about localization things. But this was motivated by the fact that my colleagues made fun of me mercilessly for the word lolly. So that's making fun of my English accent-driven development. It's powerful stuff. But yeah, the key is that this is JavaScript, and we can add it to any framework or any site. That's great, but we're starting to reach some limitations and some complexity here. So the more pages we have, the longer the builds. And I mentioned that. I talked about adding build cache. That's fine, but I'd like to be cleaner about that and make it a bit more pure. We could have better build cache characteristics as well. So there I'm talking about the fact that every time something's added to the site, we purge everything, we create new instances of the pages and deploy them. And so, the resources that people have in their browser cache, if they visited them before, we could probably do better by them. The complexity I'm starting to add for all of these edge cases is starting to model the kind of mental model. Started off nice and clean as, well, a 404 will be rendered on demand, and that's that. But the more we add in here, the more complexity it starts to. I like simple mental models wherever possible, so I'd like to get back to that. And I'm also inventing things here. This model is I'm piecing a few things together. If there's a formal pattern that I could adopt, I'd rather do that, because that's just easier for other people to then pick up the project, work on it, and contribute, and I could have more confidence there. Luckily, there are numerous rendering approaches that exist now. We're not just all about pre-render something with a static site generator or do it in a monolith. There's much more nuance now. And so a few things you might have heard of. Here's three-letter acronyms for you. Marvelous. Let me unpack some of those. So some popular ones you may have heard of: ISR, or incremental static regeneration. This is what Next.js uses, and it's based on the stale while revalidate kind of caching pattern. There's also DSG, which is what Gatsby.js added recently in Gatsby 4, which is another method of so it's deferred static generation. So in other words, nominating some things to be generated in the build and some things to be generated on demand later. So deferring that. I like that title. That's kind of a nice name, actually. It's actually an implementation of the DPR pattern, which is the final one there, which is distributed persistent rendering. These two things are kind of the same thing, really. I think of distributed persistent rendering as a model for long tail builds for any framework. So similar to what Gatsby has with DSG, you say, build these things now, please, and then the others will add to our deploy later when they're first requested. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So let's move into this last phase with just, I'll see if I can do this in 2 or 3 minutes and get through this quite quickly, but let's see how we go. So removing the ceiling by adopting one of these things. Well, which one do we use? Well, I'm very eager that we add this kind of progressive rendering or this incremental rendering without doing any of the benefits of Jamstack. Now, at the very beginning, the reason I talked about this, I wanted to be able to refer back is, you know, with Jamstack, deploys are immutable, they're atomic, which means you get this ability, as we saw earlier on, to roll back to any previous state. So I want to retain that. I also want to do this, because I'm lazy, without migrating my site to another framework. At the moment, I've got a little bit of Eleventy and a little bit of serverless functions. That's it. I don't want to migrate to another framework. So I'm going to use DPR for this, distributed persistent rendering. And the way that we do that with Netlify is Netlify offers something called on-demand builders, which are our implementation of DPR in the same way that Gatsby has DSG as their implementation. So let's go ahead and do that. What's this going to mean? Well, this page won't need to do anything different. The form is just the same. The page is delivered in just the same way. But what it does when we post to that is going to change a little bit. Now the serverless function that we post to there, it will still return as a view of that data. It will still save the data into the database, but it will no longer need to trigger a rebuild. We're not doing that anymore. We're going to be adding things to the deployment progressively over time by making these requests. So this page here, the lolly view page, is actually going to resolve to that serverless function in just the same way. And I didn't show you how that happened before. That happens with a bit of a configuration. So anything that's on the lolly path will resolve to my show lolly function. And I showed you that before. That's what this looked like. We're still squinting. It's still small. But I'll show you in the same view how I changed that to using on-demand builders. We go from that to that. And let me unpack that in a little bit more detail as we go from that to that. 2 things that happen. First of all, we require a utility function from this Netlify package. And we destructure that so that we've got our builder function that we can use later on. Then the rest of the function is exactly the same. We connect to the database, we get the data that we're ready for, we populate the template with that data, and then we return it to the user. The only thing that's different other than that in this function, in this serverless function, is how we export the handler function. Now we wrap that handler function with this builder method that we've just brought in from that library. That's it. That's the end of the refactoring. That changes this previous implementation to now use on-demand builders. So now what we're having here is some pages which are generated as part of the deploy, and that's the home page and the form page, and then every other page. So the thousands of content pages, those are only added to the latest deploy the first time they're requested, but then they live as part of that deploy. So it means that we can always roll back to previous versions. They kind of honor that contract, if you like, of the Jamstack. So let's just reflect quickly, and I promise you I'm almost done. So before, this is where we were having new content. This is how we dealt with it. Well, we no longer rebuild and fill the gaps. Now what we do is we render into the cache. So I'm talking about the deploy, render into the latest deploy on the CDN on demand when first requested. Before we had these 404s that were doing the rendering, well, those are gone now. We don't do that. We render the pages either from the deployment or we generate them on demand. And when we had lots of pages, we were caching the build. We don't need to do that anymore. Now we've got fewer pages built into the deploys at build time. In fact, it's just 2 pages, so they're nice and snappy. So in case you were kind of distracted along the way, the TLDR is I deleted some stuff and I added 2 lines. I wish it was more exciting. I really wish it was more exciting to report. But I'm a big fan of simplicity. I said that from the beginning. This additive approach uses on-demand builders, as I've mentioned. It's additive. You don't need to switch and adopt an entirely different framework. You can add it into what you're doing. It can be used to augment a site, but with any framework. It doesn't matter what you built it in. We can start layering this on top. And critically, it doesn't compromise the core benefits of the Jamstack, those attributes I kind of talked about earlier on. So what's next? Well, I'm a little bit over time, so apologies for that. There are some links you might find interesting. There are things on how you can use DSG in Gatsby, as I mentioned that earlier on. That's if you're a Gatsby user, you might prefer to go that route. There's information on the stale while revalidate pattern, on how you can do the same things with Next.js. 11T is adding a serverless render model, which is actually just a utility wrapper on exactly what I just showed you using on-demand functions. Really nice. And a few other bits and pieces along the way, including the RFC for distributed persistent rendering, which is something you might be interested in. Thank you for listening. These slides are published now. Find that at render scale is the URL for that. I'll pop that in the chat in a second as well, but all of these slides and the links along with them are in there. So with that, that's my time. Thanks ever so much for listening, everyone, and I'll hand things back over.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Phil. Really good presentation, and lots of people are applauding that. Some really good stuff, and thank you so much for going through those bits.
Thank you.
Ace. So if there's any questions, obviously drop them in the chat as well. Phil's probably going to be around for a little bit longer, but maybe not too long. And he may be able to answer some other stuff on there. The next up, we've got Moriel. Just let me know when you're ready, and then we can go over to you. Thank you.
Can you see? First of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
That is step 1. All right. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Excellent. So now, one last question. Phil, first of all, thank you very much for the either lolly or what is it in the US?
It was a popsicle.
Popsicle, that's it. I have an interesting question that might actually, I will touch on a little bit. When you do the on-demand builder, which one do you cache on the on-demand, the popsicle or the lolly, or does it, or where is your accessibility goes, your localization go?
That's based on the URL. So every URL creates a unique view. So I was generating a popsicle page populated with popsicle data, which is a sentence I never thought I'd say. That's what you'll get if that's where you're rooted. But the each URL is cached as a unique view.
Perfect. So it essentially means that at worst you might have everything cached twice, right?
Yes, because I guess they're different views with different content. So even though they've been localized, they're effectively different views. So yeah, that's right. Each one will have an instance in the cache.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I'm going to touch on why I asked that, but also thank you for giving me 2. I'll take both. So hi, everyone. I'm Moriel, and I'm going to talk to you about localization on Jamstack. There's so much to delve into localization. I'm going to touch a little bit. I'm going to start my my timer here because otherwise I can go on and we'll never leave. So first off, I'm Moriel. I work at Wikipedia. I'm a systems architect. I'm thinking exactly about the things that we're talking about, except in the large scale of kind of everything that started on Phil's conversation of kind of like a very big website, but also very user generated. So we're running into all of those problems and trying to figure out how do we move into the future. And I'm also a right-to-left support evangelist or enthusiast. I speak Hebrew, which is right to left. There's a lot of issues with those kind of languages. And I'm a front-end dev. You can find me on Muipu anywhere. And if you want to delve into the troubles of right to left, there's also rtl.wtf and moriel.tech can show you what I'm up to. So let me give you a little bit of an introduction about Wikipedia and its language support. So we support a lot of languages. This is from 2015 because I cannot get a more updated figure here, but that didn't change radically, right? Especially the gaps here that you see. So Wikipedia is way up top with 288. We have Google coming close. I think Google is at 170 now. I'm not entirely sure. Either way, nowadays we support Wikipedia about 300 languages for content and 400 languages for interface. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what that means and why that separation is important. But it's a lot. And what many people don't realize is that all of those languages of Wikipedia, they're not just translations. They are specifically, each one of those are its own community. They're not just translated from English or sometimes they can start out as a translation from one to the other, but the articles are distinct, and each one of those are distinct websites with distinct communities, a lot of times with distinct rules and cultures, which also touches on localization. It kind of gives a different meaning to what localization means, because you can go and read the same article or rather an article about the same topic. And I'll give Albert Einstein as an example, because giving something political will not be suitable here, but you can think about a political example as well, right? And you might get radically different content between the Wikipedia in English and the Wikipedia in Farsi, right? So the level of localization is also in that, right? Like you have different content that may be presented for different languages and different cultures. On top of that, another thing most people don't know is that we do not just support Wikipedia. We have actually 11 other projects: Wiktionary, Wikiquote, Wikidata, Wikipedia Commons, lots and lots of them. Most of them, not all, most of them have each of those about 300 languages. So we have about 800 websites. Phil, you and I need to sit for, I don't know, coffee or sometime to work out how to Jamstack that. On-demand builders for 800 websites. But yeah, I joke, but we are actually thinking about how to, move into the future, because right now Wikipedia is very monolithic. But it's going to be very, very much of a challenge to figure out what it means even to try and decouple something like this. So big, and that has so many cultures, right, and individual websites and content that is so spread. So there are very specific kind of principles that we go with when we talk about content and interface translation. The first thing, everything must be translatable. All features, anything cannot go out if it's not fully translatable. All translations must be crowdsourced, just like Wikipedia itself, by the communities. Translators should be made aware of nuance and context, and I'll touch on why that's important in a minute. And everything that has to do with localization has to be seamless. Wikipedia works because it's worldwide and by the people, and we have to keep that going with localization as well. So what does content and interface look like? Well, this is what content look like. You can have, this is the mobile view, but it's pretty much the same in the desktop. You have, the article on English Wikipedia about Albert Einstein. You can press a little button here that gives you all the available languages. So all the other Wikipedias that have the same article or an article about the same person. And then you can switch. This time I switched to Hebrew. This is Albert Einstein in the Hebrew Wikipedia. Note that they do not look the same. That's because each one of those is written, not only a translation, but literally written by different communities. They do touch, that they work off of one another, of course, but content is different. It's two different websites. This is what interface language means. So this is Spanish Wikipedia, but the idea is that you can contribute to any Wikipedia anywhere, and you might have a rudimentary understanding of Spanish, but you would like to help out with some administration stuff. So for that, we also give you the option to change the interface to English. So you are still looking at the Spanish Wikipedia, but your entire, I don't know if I'll go back and forth again. So this is Spanish, and all your menus are not in English, but it's the same Wikipedia, right? This is great. It can create its own challenges, because what if I speak Hebrew and I want my menus in Hebrew? Well, this is what it looks like now. I'm not going to get into right-to-left support because it's going to blow everybody's mind, and I will link to it so that you can blow your own minds. But if I do that, we will never get out of here. So just trust me that it flipped for a reason. But the idea here is that you have a separation between your interface, right? Like your menus, your interface, everything, and the content itself. This is still Spanish Wikipedia, but my interface is Hebrew. So what does that mean for like Jamstack architecture and localization? Well, Jamstack kind of works, right, with the distributed architecture. You have API-driven stuff. You have decoupled front ends, right? Like you can have multiple front end, not just one. You may have user-driven content. You have localized CDNs that give you static assets. How do we kind of, what do we need to do in order to make sure that these kind of architecture can support localization? What kind of localization we're talking about is an interesting question, because up until now, and I took this from the Jamstack website, kind of the transitional web, you had like the internationalization and localization everywhere, and it really depended. Mostly, it probably was in the app server a little bit and the CMS, but it definitely was some of the things in the client, and it really depended kind of like what you needed. But in here in Jamstack, we have a problem of a lot of the things are decoupled, right? Like which should not be a problem, and is usually not a problem, and it's what we need to do. But in terms of localization and language support, it might be, because some of the things you might need to be a little bit more coupled in terms of the language and how you want to serve things. So it just requires a different kind of thinking. And we need to remember that some of the localization need to exist a little bit in the client, or at least some level between the CDN. And that's the reason why, Phil, I asked you that question of like, ooh, you're localizing. That's awesome. But where are you doing that, right? Like, is it the first person that comes to that content will be the one dictating what localization it has? Or is it, something that you allow for localization based on the user? And there's a lot of times not a direct answer about which one of those is better, by the way. I'm not entirely sure that I can tell you that in all cases, it's always better to give all options, especially if all options is 300 languages. I don't know if you want to have 300 versions of the same web page in your CDN all the time, right? But it is something that you definitely need to consider, depending on your product, on your app, how many languages you need, et cetera, et cetera. So design your app with those things in mind, even if you're not adding those translations immediately, right? Even if you say, I only want one language, or I'm not, but I might in the future. You have to start thinking about those things fairly early on. It usually gets split to, on the client side, you're going to have interface translations, input methods, different languages, user inputs, local conversions, time, numbers, etc. And usually what we kind of refer to the API level, the backend, you'll have more content, localization in terms of either language or numbers. I want to say geographic location, but I'm going to explain in a minute why that is not necessarily the best. But that is kind of the separation that we usually see. And for the most part, that is what you probably want to design for. So let's go over some of the main pitfalls that I see a lot, and people talk to me a little bit about, kind of like, okay, I have a website and now I need to add internationalization, and now I see that I run into all those problems. This is not a complete list, but we will never get out if I make a complete list. So let's start with a few of them. So one of the bigger ones is people tend to forget that there are gendered languages. And when you do something like welcome to Wikipedia, that's great. And you only need one of those for whatever gender pronouns. That is not correct for Spanish, for example. Bienvenido and bienvenida. And Spanish is not alone. French, Hebrew, Arabic, there's a whole bunch of languages where it is gendered. In fact, there's some languages where there's more than just the unfortunate two genders that we are binary limited to in English. So you need to really consider how you want to approach your users and what you want to support. And that is requiring, when you ask for language preference, to perhaps also ask what the user's pronouns are. And I will warn here that you should not ask for what gender or what sex the person is. You should ask what the language preference is, because those are two different things that are a lot of times unrelated, and you really can serve your audience better. As someone who is both Hebrew speaker, who is a gendered language, and a woman, who means that the default, quote unquote, usually in most of the languages is the male form. I can tell you that it is really annoying to have welcome to somewhere that is not for me. We're in 2021, so consider those things. These are things that people tend to forget, that there are other languages and they have genders, and you need to ask those if you want to respect those. Another pitfall that we see a lot is localization of numbers. So this is usually how, if you speak English, you will see a number with or without the commas, but some separation, but usually threes, right? That is not how a lot of other places separate their numbers. So Spanish uses dots and then comma. French does not use commas, uses a no break space. And then we have these where it depends where you are. You're still kind of Latin based, right? And in some cases you're still English, but it depends on your location. And this is where the whole geographic location comes in. It's very, very common online, and sometimes ridiculously creating a ridiculous amount of very silly mistakes. I'll go over something that Google is doing in a minute. It's very common to say, well, if you're in some geographic location, I'm going to serve you what fits to this geographic location. But that ignores the fact that we're a universal world right now, and people live in various locations that that's not their culture or necessarily with the culture that they identify with. And B, a lot of those things are not necessarily by geography, right? You can see here English in India is not just English, like it's separating differently. If you went only by the language or only by the location, you may get it wrong. So a lot of those things require you to kind of verify and ask, and let the user decide for themselves what they want to get, right? And to the point about the popsicles and lollipops, if I'm a British person living in the US, maybe I want to see a lollipop. So in this case, it's it's a very a small website, and I wouldn't want Phil to completely rewrite it right now. But if you have something bigger and you have something that you want to be localizing, have the user tell you what they want. Don't make assumptions. You might be able to make a preliminary assumption. It might be a good thing to start, but then let the user change it. Here are more examples of other such numbers. Some of them are very different than others, right? Another thing, this is a big one, sentence structure and clarity. This is things that we see a lot. So you would have a set of inputs that go like start, event, from, and then there's some inputs, to, and then another input. In many languages, either that sentence is not in the same order of words, so those inputs would not make sense. Or in this case, in Hebrew, the from and to are actually word prefixes. They're not words of their own, which makes this entire thing just make no sense if you're in Hebrew. So be very, very careful when you are putting a like a form or inputs inside a sentence. The general recommendation is avoid that. Make it a form. I know that everybody thinks that this is great and looks wonderful when it's inside. It's kind of like seamless inside the sentence, but usually it's also not good for your UX and accessibility in any case. So consider having labels, proper labels, and a proper form, because some languages do not work the same way. Another thing, inferring burst of physical location, which I touched on a little bit. Let me give you a quick example. Google search assumes what kind of search you want based on your physical location, which is completely frustrating when you're traveling. So I don't know how many of you tried that, but if you're traveling, so when I travel to Israel, luckily I know the language, but if I travel to Israel and my roommate from the US calls me and says, I need something and I want to check something on Google, that has nothing to do with Israel. It's from my, from home. I have to fight Google to get, American-centric results from quote unquote back home, because Google just decides for you that if you are in whatever country, that's what the results you need to get. And I got the same thing when I visited India, which at least in Israel, I speak the language. In India, I don't. So it was very, very frustrating. Don't do that. Ask the user. Or at the very least, I mean, you can do that as a preliminary thing, kind of like the easiest, that's fine. But then allow the user to change it, to say, nope, you're wrong. I'm just visiting here. Please don't assume that I am a native. So lastly, I know that I need to start hurrying up. I think, I have 5 more minutes according to my counter. So good. I can talk to you about out of context translations, which is another like fascinating thing that I love. I love to kind of like talk about. There are a lot of words, especially in English, that sound like they're very accurate, and they actually cannot be translated very well unless you know the context. So a lot of times I see people use the same word in multiple locations, in multiple buttons, and let the translators just translate it once. And that usually doesn't work, because in a lot of other languages, you have nuances that will dictate a different word if it's a different context. I'll give you an example here. How would you translate a button that has, check on it? And we see that a lot. Is that check as in verify something? Is that I have a selection of checkboxes and I want to check one? What is this? Well, in this case, it's checkmate. Check what you say before checkmate. Well, that's a radically different word in a lot of other languages than the word check to verify, right? So what we do, so what you can see here, message documentation, we call it the QQQ, because that is not a language code. So we have our JSON files in language codes, EN, SE, all that, ES. QQQ will never be a language code, so we took that to be our documentation. And to each one of our translation bit or whatever, we attach an explanation, and the explanation is supposed to give you context. So whenever anyone goes to translate anything of Wikipedia, they will see it. So translatewiki.net is what we use to translate our systems. It is free for any open source project. So if you have an open source project and you want to have languages, you don't have to have all 300, but you may. You can definitely use this. This is the interface you're going to see when you translate. So this is, you can see the original. You can type the new one, but on the right-hand side, you can see the context. This is for this kind of tab. It has this meaning. Watch out for gender, right? Like it needs to be gendered. And there are suggestions based on other things. So all of this with context is really, really important. Otherwise, you get a little bit of a nonsensical stuff. And so here are some internationalization tools for you. If you want to use this kind of translation that supports gender and supports number localization, supports everything that I was talking about. Plus, we have a couple of versions of, we call it Banana ITN because it goes with the Banana style JSON. We have vanilla JS of Banana ITN, Vue.js version, and React version. And there is CSS Janus, which is a system to flip around terminology inside CSS for right-to-left languages. Those are free, open source for you to use. What happened to my... Oh, oops. Hang on. Sorry. I clicked the link. So to sum up, localization is usually not very straightforward. So you have to design for it early, and you have to make sure that you understand where it goes, in which layer, especially when you talk about distributed systems and you talk about microservices. You need to know and figure out which one needs to do what in terms of localization. Separate your content and interface localizations. That's usually important. Consider any user inputs. Are you allowing users to add in usernames in any language? Then even if your website is always English or always your language, if your username has different languages in, you also have concerns with fonts, with directionality, all that kind of stuff. So consider which parts of your website do you allow for languages and localizations. Please think about right-to-left languages. Those exist and are usually underserved, and they can flip your interface. And I think the key here is those last 2 bullet points. First of all, watch out for assumptions. As we talked about, Google making assumptions that your geography is what you are. All those assumptions about gender, all those assumptions about how to properly translate. Don't make assumptions. You can make quick attempts to kind of like do something very quickly and then ask your user. and test your app with native speakers. That's always very important. Thank you. So go forth and Jamstack locally or localizably. That's all from me. How do I?
This is awesome. Thank you, Moriel. There was a few questions in the chat. If we could, if you got a little bit of time to answer them.
Sure.
I think Rebecca put would love this for currency on e-commerce sites also. So I guess that's just
yes,
complementing the stuff that you're doing.
And remember to make sure with the user, because again, currency, you can live in another country and use a currency. So don't automatically assume that that's the currency and stick it.
Awesome. And I think Liam put a question in to say, how you mentioned the fact that you should be asking the user what language they want the content to be served. He's saying, what language should that asking bit be in? So
look, you have to make some initial assumptions, right? We all do. So you do have some starting positions. You can start assuming from the language of the browser. You can get that information. You can fall back. There are ways to kind of figure out where to fall back to. Use that initial language to fall back. The other, and then ask the user, or give the user a thing to say, oh, thanks for guessing, you guessed wrong, and then change it, right? Like just give the user something. There are ways, by the way, there are some language pickers that give a list of languages that are written both in the language that you see and the language of the language. So you can look for Hindi in Hindi, which helps. So you can do also that. That's a little bit more complicated, but there are tools out there that let you do that. So that can kind of, but I think the main thing is just let the user override your initial, right, like decision. That's the main thing, however way that happens.
Thanks. And I think I'm along with Scott, and I guess the rest of probably the audience is like, would you be able to kind of share some of the resources that you've actually shown on the presentation?
Yes, let me make the presentation public because it's a Google presentation, and I can share the link here. Awesome,
that's great. Thank you. Awesome. So I think that's a really good presentation again. So next up, we've got Scott. Just let me know when you're ready, Scott, and over to you.
Sure, I'm ready. Thank you, Moriel. That was very enlightening and quite mind-blowing at the same time. So I look forward to checking out the resources and bookmarking them for the next time I have to do anything with internationalization. Unlike Phil, I change frameworks. So this is just a bit of an overview of what I've been doing with SvelteKit and how that works with the content layer and what I do for my job. So I'm hoping you can all see the slides. My name's Scott. I work for GraphCMS as a developer advocate, and GraphCMS is a headless API content management system, and we really pride ourselves on delivering structured content at scale. We're one of the first, if not the first, headless GraphQL-based CMS, and we're completely all in on GraphQL. GraphQL native to this day from the start, and that's what we provide for content. So this will be a brief history of content on the web, where we are now and where we're going. But it's mainly about Svelte and SvelteKit and how much I've enjoyed using it in recent months. So, okay, a bit more about me. Just said my name's Scott, massive Jamstack enthusiast. I've spoken here for a couple of times now, so thank you, Ilesh. Thanks for having me come on again and talk about a different framework again. I'm currently helping out with organising the Svelte London meetup. There's one on the 13th of December. It's like a Christmas party / review of the Svelte Summit, which happened over the weekend. If you're interested in coming, you can find it on Meetup. I'm currently helping out with some of the community stuff there. I'm helping out with Svelte Sirens with Brittany Postma, just helping integrate GraphCMS into that project. And I've recently held a workshop at the Jamstack Conf for building with SvelteKit and GraphQL. And there's also a Jamstack Explorers mission, very similar to that workshop. And I'm a cat dad, and during Phil and Moriel's talk, they were just harassing me, but they've all gone now. So, and I can't show my camera anyway, so we're not going to see them anyway. So, as with talks like this, I'm sure everyone's heard them. We're going to need to bring up the past to justify the present, so we can move on to the future. But first, a bit of a history lesson. So the past, this is the not so distant past, and for some, their current reality. So this is how things started initially. We're using FTP, FileZilla, and I can't remember any of the other clients. FileZilla is the one which I'm terribly familiar with, where you would sort of, if you want to change the site, you'd push up. I see you, Ben. Right, you'd push up your changed file straight to the server, and that was it. That was how it happened. Developers did that. But there then became a requirement for authoring content without a need for a developer. So the content management system was born. So it all started with the need to edit content online in a managed way without a need for developer intervention, like I said. So the traditional CMS was born. So let's take a quick look at that back in the day. Website-based, heavily theme-based, a lot of them. They're all server rendered, tightly coupled, and you pay for everything. And they were often slow. This was for the round trip from like the client to the database and then back to the client again. So often slowed things down. So this was like what we refer to now as the monolith, and which where we were for quite a while, but things have changed. So some of the tools from back then, sorry for the light screen if you're in the dark mode. Some of the tools from back then included Drupal, WordPress, AEM, Adobe Experience Manager. These are all referred to as like monolith. As someone who's relatively new to web development, I've been doing it for about 5 years now. These technologies are still present in my daily workflow, working at agencies, and I worked with them quite a lot. But let's not dwell on that. Although I do acknowledge that these tools are still used across a lot of the web now, like massively. Okay, so that brings us to the present, and let's talk about the present and where we are now. But first, let's talk terminology. And unlike Phil, I'm not going to be using TLAs or three-letter acronyms. Yeah, buzzwords and hype. Don't worry, I'm not going to be talking about Web3. But while we're talking about naming things, headless, slight tangent here. I'm sure the majority of you have heard the term serverless. Serverless because you're making calls to a specific server, you're making calls to APIs. These abstract away the service from you whilst guaranteeing uptime, reliability, scalability, etc. So is headless serverless? I don't know. Anyway, I was just thinking about that when I did this, so I thought I'd add them to this slide. I'm not sure how much time we've got actually, Ilesh, but I don't want to be going on too long. So if I do start rambling, I do apologise. So anyway, back to the present. So JavaScript really matured in recent years. It's now basically a runtime for the browser, and as developers, we can do a lot more in the browser. Headless is decoupled from the monolith. So this means that this is where content is outgrowing the internet at the moment. So as a developer, you need, with a headless CMS or headless anything serverless, you don't need to worry about on the client all you need to worry about on the client is how to present the data. So like destinations for this are growing every day, like websites, apps, in-store displays, cars, fridges. There's lots of places where you need to get this information. So the headless CMS solved that problem for omni-channel content distribution, and this is where the developer can request data on any client basically. So that's the sort of content mesh bit really. So headless CMS, what is headless CMS? Sort of just gone over that. Gives developers a lot of flexibility to implement what they like. So it's front-end agnostic. They're mostly CRUD at the moment, decoupled. There's a lot of developer flexibility with what you need. How you get it, what I've just sort of highlighted with clients being in so many different places, and modern workflow tools now like continuous integration, continuous deployment with Git workflows just make it a really nice place to be at the moment. So let's talk about where we're going briefly, because I just want to talk about SvelteKit. But I've got to sort of wrap this up into what I've been working with for the last sort of 6-7 months now. So GraphQL, if you haven't heard of it, it's a query language for getting your information from an endpoint. It's simple to understand. You get what you see, you get what you ask for. It's going to be done on the client and server side, and that's it. Very simple. Here's a very small example, and this sort of goes into what I'm talking about for content federation with my company GraphCMS, but it's something which is like seen as a lot of people want, a lot of developers want this content from many different sources. So with content federation, content federation is just a fancy term for bringing together data from various sources. So let's take a look at that. Step through this. Yeah, okay. So we've got our query, which is just going to return us some products. So in our GraphCMS, or any CMS for that matter, we could have our name and description of that in rich text. And then from a third-party API, we could have the inventory, how much is there, if it's in stock, etc. So we're working on sort of bringing all that into one place. But I'm sort of here to talk about Svelte and how that fits in here. So when I say Svelte, I also mean SvelteKit, but SvelteKit, it's not going to be SvelteKit for much longer because SvelteKit is still in public beta, but it's basically going to be Svelte soon once it comes out of public beta. So here's how I get started with Svelte. It's just an npm init command, and you have the @next there, and then like the folder which you're going to create the project into. Once Svelte goes to V1, this will just change to Svelte. So this will be like the one-stop shop for making any Svelte project. And I really should just be calling it Svelte now. And I try to refer to it as that other than SvelteKit, but SvelteKit has a lot of additional features over Svelte. So once it gets to V1, then all this confusion will go out of the way and you could just talk about it as Svelte. So if you're unfamiliar with Svelte, here's the layout of a typical Svelte file. So in SvelteKit, which I'll come to like the file structure and stuff shortly, but I mean, everyone's familiar with HTML. Svelte is a superset of HTML. So you can have your script, and in there you can define any JavaScript you want. In this one here, we're just defining a variable, and then in our markup, we're just using that variable in some markup. And then you can also have scoped styles, and I'm highlighting this with my mouse, but nothing's actually happening. So have I got like drawing stuff? Here we go. Let's try this. Ah, very nice. So you have scoped styles to the component. If you have like global styles and stuff you want to persist across different routes, we'll need something called like a layout. I'll come on to that shortly though, and I need to slow down a bit. Sorry if I'm talking too fast, everyone. So let's just step through this. So we define the variable, and then we're just using it in a markup, and that's how simple Svelte is, and I really like it. So this would be if you want to in SvelteKit, you can request data before the page loads, and SvelteKit provides a load function here, and this is just like a bridge code really. I'm just returning a variable which hasn't been created, but this is how you would sort of get data from any source, and then you could just start using it in your in the body of your page or your component. Okay, let's just bin that, move on. So let's take a look at how we would go about using GraphQL with a Svelte project. We can start by taking a look at a client-side GraphQL library. This one's called Urkel. Urkel is Universal React Query Library. It's a great GraphQL client, and it's got Svelte bindings, which is really nice. There's loads to it, and I'm really enjoying playing about this at the moment. So an Urkel client can be initialized anywhere in a Svelte project, but as I sort of hinted on earlier, a layout component is a good place to have it in the client, as it will be available throughout the project. So this is kind of like you would do like a context provider in React, but with a lot less boilerplate. Let's take a quick look. Excuse me. So in our roots folder in our project, we'd have this underscore layout file, and that's a special notation. There's a couple of files in SvelteKit which use this notation. I won't go on to the other ones, but this one is basically where you would put your global styles, anything which needs to be persisted across root changes, like a header, a navigation bar, and a footer. And we would define our client from Urkel, and then we would use we'd initialize our clients, pass in our GraphQL API. There is one thing to note here, which I haven't touched on, is that SvelteKit uses Vite or Vite. I like to call it Vite, and this is how you would import an environment variable in with Vite. And if you're familiar with Vite, you know that the Vite underscore means that that environment variable is available on the client. So any files which are in like the source roots file, that environment variable could be exposed. So I'm mentioning that now because it's like the basis for the rest of that talk. We also have like this would be like React Children for this slot here, where basically just wrap everything, and this is like the wrapper for the whole project, let's say. I'll try not to make many more comparisons to React, but I've been a React developer for 3 or 4 years, so it's hard not to. And I'm just trying to make it understandable for the rest of you. So that's our layout component. So we've got our Urkel client available to us throughout the project now. So in our index file now, I can go and write a query. That's what the GQL tag is for here. So I can just write a GraphQL query and some backticks, and then I can pass that to the operation store here, and then query for the posts. So for all of the examples here, I'm just using a blog, like a website, like a blog site as the example. I think it's a tried and tested example, and everyone sort of understands that. So I'm just getting the posts here, and then we're using this query posts, and then that will add the results of that query to it'll be like a subscription store, which can be accessed throughout the project, much like context, but without any of the boilerplate. So one of my favorite ways to visualize data coming in to a Svelte component is just to use a pre-tag in the body of the file, and then I can just bung this into this comes after the script tag in the body of the component, and then this I can just see what data I'm getting back from the Urkel client, and again the dollar here, this just means that it's a subscription. So anytime there's changes in the operation store, it will change with it. So this gives some output like this. So I've got the post data commented out because everyone knows what that looks like. But we get this handy property from Urkel, which tells us if it's fetching or not. So then we've got that, and then we can start using some of the Svelte expressions to work through the Urkel response. So Urkel has the fetching state built in so that we can check before rendering. If it's fetching still, we can just put our loading spinner or repeat egg. If there's an error, we can just return with an error. Otherwise, we're going to just render out an unordered list here of all the posts titles and the link to that post. And again, this is another Svelte expression to work through the data. You could think of this as just like the dot map in React. I'll stop talking about React. Okay, so as I mentioned with the import env, what was it, import meta.env example on the slide earlier, it's great and all, but what about sensitive information? So like authentication tokens, sensitive stuff like that, you don't want to have that on the client. So I'm just going to talk a bit about that, and then I think we're just going to wrap up. So there's going to be a bit more code examples, but before we look at leaking credentials, I didn't tell you that Svelte has file-based routing. So let's take a quick look at that. So SvelteKit routes, it has a file rating system, very much like Next.js. So these routes can be turned into endpoints as well. Oops, let's put it down. Sorry. So let's take a quick look at a project file structure using file-based routing, first of all. So let's step through this. We have our index file, and then we have our layout file, which we've just spoken about. So the layout file would have our client in there. The index file we could we're using to display the information from our GraphQL query, and then that was rendering out list links to the slug here. So if you're familiar with Next.js routing, then you should be familiar with this. If not, I don't think I've got time to go into it now, but we've got another slide which I'm hoping it'll help you understand that. So let's just take a quick look at endpoints. So we've got our file-based routing here, which is the slug notation. So when we have, when we click on a link from that previous slide, which was way back here. So this href, this href here is /posts/post.slug. That would route us off to this file here, parceling that slug. I'm going to come back to that, but I just want to talk about endpoints quickly as well. So this is this here. So the .json.js notation is a bit funky, but let's just roll with it for now. And maybe I'll just show you a live example of why I think it's great. But while we're just going through these slides, we're just going to pop in a GraphQL client in the lib folder here. So that like a very basic project would look something like this with our GraphQL client up here. And in our GraphQL client, we would just have, be using GraphQL request, not Urkel this time. Sorry, just get a drink. And then we're using our import meta again here, but this time it's in the lib folder. So I've been grilling the Svelte community about this, and I've been assured that this is safe. There is another way to do it, which is what I've been doing it previously with a tool like env CMD, where you can load up the environment variables server side and they stay there. But I've been assured that this is safe to do it this way. Anyway, moving on. So this is, let's get rid of that. So this is what that endpoint would look like. So in an endpoint, you can create REST methods. So I know I was talking about GraphQL, but this is why SvelteKit is great, because you've got the best of both worlds here. So we can create a REST method, get, put, delete, etc. is del in SvelteKit because deletes the reserved word in JavaScript. This endpoint can be accessed from the client via a browser fetch call. So let's take a look at how that works. Let's just go through this quickly. So we've got a get function, bringing in request response, and then inside a try catch, again, we're defining our query, and then we are destructuring the posts out of the response from the GraphQL request passing in that query. And then we're just going to return a status of 200 and a body of posts. You'll notice that I'm not setting the content type here because that was set in the file type. So this up here. So moving on. So I touched on the context module briefly in one of the earlier slides where this can load before the page. So this load function runs before the page loads. It's an async function, and we just use also in here where we're importing the SvelteKit wrapper for the browser fetch because this is essentially server side, and we're going off to our posts.json endpoint. And if we've got a good response, then we're just going to return the props. So props is what we'd export let props is basically just receiving props from that component. Just trying to put into React terms again, but let's just roll with it. Export let posts means that in a Svelte component, it's just like accepting props. Okay, so in our index.svelte file still, so there should be source roots.index.svelte. No, that is right, source index.svelte. We can use the Svelte directives again to loop through the contents of each post. And then you'll notice this SvelteKit prefetch here. This is a really handy SvelteKit feature where if you hover over that link, this will run the load function of that route and start running that. But what about the credentials? I didn't really speak about sensitive stuff. I know I mentioned about using something like env.cmd. I'm going to keep on with the right way to do it because I don't want to sort of muddy the waters any more than I may be with rattling through these examples. But with this, we would just we have our GraphQL endpoint. We'd also define like a permanent auth token, our sensitive credentials in here, and we'd export that in a GraphQL client. But for our post token, we'd add in our bearer token here, and we'd just have a different client. And that's how I've been doing it with the sort of projects I've been working on. So if we want to have somewhere where we're going to add a mutation, so in the context of a blog, we want to add a post, let's say, we bring in our post client, which we've just defined. Then we would use a post rest method. We'd get out any of the variables from the request body, and then we'd use those in our query for adding a post. I haven't got enough page space like Phil did with his fancy example. We'd get our variables from our body as well. We pass those into the post client, and then we would await would return the body ID for our response. Okay, that is it. So how am I doing for 20 minutes? Wow, I'm sorry, I did take quite a long time. If there's any more you want to know, I've written about Svelte extensively on the GraphCMS blog, also on my own blog, so you can check out any information there. If there's any information you want on GraphCMS, some of the stuff which I touched on, but you need a bit more detail, just check out the docs. And you can find me anywhere online as Spence S10. Find me on Twitter and GitHub, and my site scottspence.com is for posts on Svelte and SvelteKit. And these slides are here. I could put these into the chat right now. No, I can't. I can't copy this for some reason. And that's it. So, thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Scott. There's one question for you, which is, do you know or are you aware of any Svelte sample app sites that could be used in terms of on GitHub?
Yeah, check out my GitHub, Liam. I can see the question. So you check out my GitHub and just searching my repos for anything Svelte, and there's quite a lot in there. There's there's stuff not relating to GraphCMS as well. So you can there's like there's a Markdown blog example. My site is based off of that example as well, and there's some auth examples in there as well. So there's quite a lot of stuff I've done personally. There's a lot of people making some great stuff out there as well. So I'm not sure if anyone knows that Rich Harris, he got brought on by Vercel to work on Svelte full time. So I think it's going to start moving pretty quickly with all of that. So Andre shared something. There's a link.
Yeah, I think it's for content. So that's the other question that Liam had. So that's great.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so
Ace. No, that's brilliant. Thanks, Scott. Thanks for coming back as well. And it's great to have you. No worries. So next up is Alistair. Alistair, just give us a shout once you're ready.
Yeah, we'll do 2 seconds. I'll get this going. Share. Okay, can you see that?
I can see it.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, cool. Thanks for the intro, Ilesh, and thank you to all the previous guys. I'll try to be as quick as I can with this. But yeah, I'm Alistair. I'm a front-end developer based in Edinburgh in Scotland. I work for an agency called SeriesEight, and we work on all sorts of stuff, but a bit of Jamstack and a lot of image CDNs. So today I'm talking about how image CDNs can make our lives a bit easier as developers, particularly working with the Jamstack. So firstly, kind of a current state of images on the web is kind of as a bit of an intro. But Alistair, how you say, why do we need to bother that? Images are easy. Image tag, pop a source on there, an alt tag, because we like accessibility here, but that's all's needed. Okay, right, that's good. Bye. Well, I wish. Unfortunately, it doesn't consider a lot of the challenges we face developing sites, particularly when it comes to performance. Jamstack's great for performance, but and we need to kind of go through that all the way with our images too. There's some movement on the next slide, so if that's an issue, watch out for that. One of those things is responsive imagery. So we're building the same website for all sorts of different devices now. So a phone, a tablet, a desktop, all of these are display images of different sizes, different screen resolutions. And it's not just as simple as big screen, big image. See here in this example that the tablet and phone are actually displaying these images larger than the desktop. So that's something that can be quite tricky to keep in mind. So for that, we need to generate many different sizes of our images to serve the right one, depending on the screen size and the size it's displayed at. That's the movement over, so if that's an issue, look back. Another thing to consider is image format. Here I took a 300 kilobyte JPEG from Unsplash and optimized it through a tool called squish.app, which is amazing, and then converted it into a few different formats. All of these at the full size on a high density display look pretty much identical, but you see the WebP is significantly smaller than the JPEG, and the AVIF and JPEG XL are both significantly smaller than that. JPEG XL is currently not supported anywhere really, but that will be coming in the next few years. But AVIF is supported by Chrome, so we could be getting major savings for our Chrome users. WebP is supported by pretty much all evergreen browsers now, although some older Safari and Apple devices won't do. So we still need JPEG in there. So we've got several different formats in order to get the best performance with the maximum compatibility. Another thing to consider, which is something that is quite niche, and I only learned about fairly recently, is high DPI images, because an iPhone now, for example, will display an image that is 2-3 times larger than the size it's displayed at on screen, which is great for it looking really sharp, but has an exponential increase in size for downloading, which is not ideal for performance. But what we can do to mitigate that is compress images more when they're at a higher resolution for higher resolution devices, which mitigates some of that impact on performance that has. So you see here in this example, I've got a quality 40 at the top in the source and a quality 80 in the image, which is different compression levels to reduce that file size. We also consider lazy loading and decoding. Maybe we need those, maybe we don't, which means we have this monster of markup. I would not bother writing this by hand. I'll go there and say, I'm just the basic image tag. But in all seriousness, in order to consider 3 different image formats, 6 different sizes for different for responsive imagery, high DPI and standard DPI quality levels, width, attributes, height attributes, loading, decoding, we end up with this huge picture tag for one image on a web page. Yeah, I'll show that image resizing. Cool. And that's all to just display a few images on a web page, or that was specifically one image. Imagine that for hundreds. So that was for the web at large. But what about specifically the Jamstack? How does that kind of play into things? So there's, generally speaking, 3 ways that people are handling images with the Jamstack. They're maybe doing it manually. So on a small scale, you can be resizing or reformatting images yourself. There's some great tools to do that. But that can be quite cumbersome if you've got a big site or you've got lots of images. So maybe you've written a custom code or process using a library like Sharp or something like that, or using a package or component that comes with your site generator or as plugin like NextImage or 11t image. Regardless of whether you're doing it manually or a process, there's a lot that needs to happen for these images. We saw the markup before. This is for that one instance, that one image. We've got 36 images, I think it is, several different formats, several different qualities, several different image sizes. So even if you're doing this automatically, you're not having to create these manually, that's still a lot happening there. And if you count all of that size column there, you've got, I mean, over a megabyte of different versions of this image to deal with. So I've put together kind of an ideal image processing wish list that we can think about things with. So we should ideally convert to several different formats and be able to update to support new ones. Maybe AVIF doing that now or soon. JPEG XL coming sometime in the next few years. We should resize images to many different sizes for responsive imagery. We should handle different quality levels depending on density. And I've got a last one that's a bit of a bonus because very few tools do this at the moment. But sometimes a well-optimized JPEG can be smaller than its well-optimized WebP or even AVIF equivalent, which doesn't make it as simple as WebP is always better than JPEG. Most of the time it is, but not always. So really we should check whether the WebP for this image is smaller than its JPEG equivalent. And then we wouldn't serve the WebP, we'd serve the JPEG instead. But that is, as I'm sure you can imagine, trying to think how you might implement that, a real nightmare to do on a per image basis. And that is why very few tools do it. And also with the picture element, you can only do it as a generally all of these images. You can't do it on a per size basis, which is why I put it as a bonus. One impact that specifically faces the Jamstack this is if you're doing this on build, it'll have a big impact on your build time. Heard people talk about build time before with Phil mentioning earlier, and processes that run on build, optimizing images, can have a big impact. So here I added 40 images to the 11T based blog starter, just 40, processed with 11T image with the default settings, and it added over 3 minutes to build time. For 40 image, I mean, for a lot of the websites I work on, 40 images is fairly modest. Sure, they were quite large, but that can have, I mean, I worked on a website with hundreds, maybe reaching into thousands of images. If this was doing that on every build, that would take forever. Okay, so I'm going to take you back to 2019 to a site I was building at the time, which kind of frames the circumstances that made me try out an image CDN in the first place. This is the website. It's an art gallery local to where I grew up. It's called 1896 Gallery. We were building a brand new site with a new design, fully client-managed content. The architecture was a headless CMS, that we've heard from earlier, using 11T and pulling that data in from the headless CMS so the client could log in and upload content themselves. One of the key things is this is an art gallery, so the key things is pictures of the art. At the time of launch, there was around 20 artists, up to 40 to 50 pieces each. So you're talking hundreds of studio quality images, and these images were, you're talking 20 meg each. Absolutely huge, stunning, but a bit of a pain to deal with. And the client said to me fairly near the beginning during the brief, the art on the new website has to be as high quality as possible. One of the things I am kind of really passionate about for the Jamstack and in my front-end development is performance. So this put me in a bit of a situation where the best solution to performance is to reduce the quality of images, but the client is wanting, and the website really is wanting, high quality images. So it's a bit of a kind of difficult one to work out how to best do this. So I built my own process using Sharp, the custom processes. I said earlier, this is what I was doing. This is the kind of wish list I had before. It converted to WebP, easy-ish to add APIF when that eventually came out. It resized images to many different sizes. Fine, cool. Didn't handle differing quality levels. I didn't know about that time, so I'll give myself a pass there. And it didn't perform quality analysis, mostly because I mean, even now with a lot more knowledge of how to do that, I cannot work out how I would implement a custom process that would do this now. It's just too difficult for this instance. So seemed great. We merged it, all good. It increased the build time by about 10 minutes, which for a website that headless CMS that on change deploys the site, and then the client has to wait 50 or in this case 12 minutes, potentially up to 14-15 minutes in order to see the change they just made live, was not acceptable, really, and especially when compared to kind of monolithic WordPress, GraphCMS, whatever architectures they were more familiar with, that was just looked terrible. But Image CDNs came to my rescue here. So I've mentioned them a couple times, but what are Image CDNs? Well, they're a third-party service that sells solutions and products that makes working with images easier for developers and helps developers improve the performance of images. More specifically, they're a content delivery network. So that's a kind of network of servers all over the globe that specialize in processing and caching images for you. It sits between your server and the user, transforming images on the fly based on the URLs they're requested with. Here's a few examples of big ones. A lot of people have heard of Cloudinary because they're they're the kind of big player, but these are a few others. So here's a kind of wee quick diagram to show. So this is your standard model of you have browser, server, all of your assets just go directly from your server to the browser. Maybe there's some caching layers or CDN in the way, but regardless, they're all going through the same process. It changes when we add an image CDN. And it sits, so your HTML, your CSS, and your JavaScript continue to go straight from your server to the browser. Your images, however, go via the image CDN. So the browser requests an image from CDN, and then it requests it from the server in turn. There's also kind of an alternative model for this is if we had our assets in a different place from our website, maybe with an AWS bucket or something like that, S3 bucket rather, then we could request a source image from somewhere else, but it's still the same process there. Okay, but how do we actually use them? So we start with our image CDN domain. This will be given to us by the company. It'll be something like alistair.cloudinary.com or something like that. Then we add the URL to the source image. This is the high quality image that is the original. But for security and kind of convenience purposes, most providers allow you to kind of shorten this into just giving it the path, and it'll go, right, okay, I know you mean that we're actually getting from our site.com when we put this. And then we add parameters to transform the image. So we're saying we want example.jpg with a width of 600 pixels and a height of 400 pixels. And then if someone visited this link, that's the resolution they'd get rather than the example.jpg's original size. Different CDN providers have different formats, but they all work on the same concept. We've still got the width and the height parameters expressed in the URL, the image we're looking for, and pointing to whatever CDN company. So some of the benefits and advantages of this is now our images are handled out with our site build. So they have a different cache layer, they have a different kind of processing, so they're separate from our builds. So our builds can run independently of them, and generally speaking, our images aren't changing in the same way that our content is or our assets are, so we can cache them for a longer period of time. Now we've got, using this, we have a team of image experts that are top in the world for optimizing and delivering images, working for us for a small amount per month, which is in itself a huge bonus. And we also have automatic format detection, and this, I think, is the killer feature of image CDNs. And that you see on the right here, we're requesting the image birchcanopy.jpg, which is a JPEG image, but what's being returned to Chrome is a WebP image. And the reason that is because it's called content negotiation. Chrome expresses the fact that it supports WebP, and the image CDN goes, okay, great. The WebP is smaller, so I can give you that instead of the JPEG. So most CDNs provide a lot of sort of transformations and things you can do to images. Here's just a couple examples. We can set specific widths and heights and use kind of this as automatic gravity, so it focuses on the center, the focal point of the image, in this case the otter, and here's one kind of anchored to the top, so we can manipulate it in various different ways. And we can also do crazy things like overlay text onto images. We can overlay images onto other images, all just by writing a URL rather than actually having to do this processing ourselves. The same with doing circles and rounded corners. Instead of just putting a border radius on, we could do this and actually remove the bytes of the corners that will never be seen. Okay, so it's all very well adding fancy effects to a single image and writing out URLs like that, but how can we actually use this as developers to make our lives easier in our kind of day-to-day work? So that previous super complicated example of markup, this is it now. So we've removed 5 source elements, and it's down to just 1, and that's due to the automatic format detection. And now we can also just set the width and the quality using the URL. So in the kind of top here with the width 300 and Q40 versus later down in the page we can tell change the width and the quality levels just using the URL. So this is a lot better than manually creating all those images and has the benefits of an image CDN, but still a lot of repetition of markup and a lot we don't really need to deal with. So depending on how you build your sites, you could make abstractions that make this super easy. And this is where the kind of developer experience and improvements really shine. I work with 11T a lot, so this is kind of my image shortcode. I give it a bit of basic information about how I want the image to appear and be sized, and the attributes I want it to have, and it'll generate that markup for me. If you use 11T, you can check out that example there. It'll be linked in later in the talk there too. And here's an example using React, just kind of as another example. The exact same principles, mostly the exact same code, but kind of also available in React. In reality, though, image CDNs make working with images just as easy as formatting strings, just adding query parameters to a URL. So they can be used in everything, React, Vue, Svelte, Angular, etc., any Jamstack tools, but also not just the Jamstack. I've worked on WordPress and GraphCMS websites using image CDNs on .NET, PHP, Shopify. I even know a few people who've built Android and iOS apps that have run the user uploaded media through an image CDN in order to handle that. So going back to my previous example there, what tangible benefits might we see from moving to an image CDN? So we could reduce our build times. Here this was reduced by 80%, a colossal decrease just by that fairly simple change. Fairly substantial image performance improvements, and this is with no other changes, just by going with a provider that knew images better than my custom process did. Lower image bytes and largest contentful paint improved. We're able to combine multiple image sources into a single endpoint. So here I combined my WordPress headless CMS and the internal graphics in my repo into a single API. And this could be the case for any headless CMS, user uploaded media, stuff like that. Okay, there is no such thing as a free lunch, though. There are some things to watch out for. I'm going to rattle through these, so not too long. Cost, there is a cost implication, but generally speaking, there's free tiers. Small sites sit well within those free tiers. So unless you've got huge sites with huge teams, it's likely cheaper and easier, and it can be offset by reduced build minutes if you're paying for those. It can make local development a bit tricky. If you've got images locally, then they aren't available remotely, but there are kind of a few methods around this. I've linked them up in my slides at the end. And for very high performing sites, which on the Jamstack, we have a few of those, the fact it's on a different origin does have an impact, but many hosts, including Netlify, can mitigate this using proxy. Okay, so wrapping up, should you consider image CDNs in your next project? Absolutely. I don't know why you'd expect me to say anything else, having just given a talk on them. They can have major benefits to our websites by improving performance of images, making working with images easier during development. And this is kind of one of the key features for me, in that I don't think I could make a website nearly as easily and as fast as I do nowadays when I use image CDNs for every site, just because they abstract stuff. So I don't have to worry about, okay, I need an image this aspect ratio, so I need to go into the CMS and add a new size to be generated and all of this. I just throw it in into my shortcode or just into the URL, and it will handle that for me. And also, extra bonus, reducing Jamstack build times. We love to see that. Okay, thank you. These slides, all my sources and all the links to code samples and references are available on my website, cube.io/Jamstack Image CDNs, and that takes you straight to it. I'll pop that in the chat. I'm on Twitter and most social media at Akudio, and my website is alistairshepard.uk. Cool, thank you.
Thanks, Alistair. This is awesome. Like, you know, CDNs are totally like, I mean, everyone needs to try and use them. So this is a really good presentation. I'm assuming there's no questions, but if there are, just fire them through. But yeah, otherwise what I'll do is grab all the slide decks from the presenters that were on today. I'll chuck them in together when I share the recording as well. So it's all available for people. Should they want to recap as well. Ace. So I guess that's it really. Thank you for the thank you to the presenters. Thank you for the people who joined. You know, we'll see you probably next year when the MMT Tech Meetups return. Thanks everyone. Cheers. Take care. Bye.